Hello, I'm Julie Posetti and I'm ICFJ's Global Director of Research. Welcome to the final episode of our Journalism and the Pandemic webinar series. This one is called the Disinfodemic. So what we want to probe today is how journalists are experiencing the COVID-19 disinfodemic and working to try and counter it. Because journalism's not just at risk of being swamped by what the World Health Organization, or WHO, calls the infodemic, which is a mix of correct and accurate information, journalism, public health information, and misinformation and disinformation. It's also a target of disinformation campaigns connected to COVID-19 and your generic political disinformation, for example. And it's a bulwark against what colleagues at UNESCO and I have called a disinfodemic. And by that, we mean this pollution in the information ecosystem in connection with COVID-19. And just yesterday, UNESCO published, or rather officially launched, 2 reports that I wrote with Professor Kalina Boncheva on that theme. So it's all very timely that we're discussing this, not least because many health officials around the world have described this infodemic or disinfodemic as being as big a risk to public health and safety as the pandemic itself. So we want to know what encounters journalists are having, fact checkers as well, and other media workers around the world with misinformation and disinformation. And what are the impacts of the disinfodemic on their work? We want to know also how news outlets are trying to counter this with their audiences through investigative journalism and so on. So as I said, this is the final episode in the series attached to the Journalism and Pandemic Project research that we're doing with the Tao Center at Columbia University. Now, normally you would see my partner in crime, as she calls herself, Professor Emily Bell, on this screen as well. But I'm afraid I'm having to do double duty because the communications in upstate New York, where she currently is, have been taken out by a thunderstorm and a hailstorm. So she unfortunately has no capacity to join us, but I'm pretty excited about the rest of the panel. So we have Coda Stories co-founder, Natalia Antelava. We have BuzzFeed's counter-disinformation specialist. I didn't want to call you a disinformation specialist, Jane, because that has all sorts of horrid implications. Jane Lytvynenko, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Rappler's CEO and co-founder, one of the world's most celebrated journalists, Maria Ressa. And Gil Scofield Jr. from the Brazilian fact-checking outfit, Agência Lupa, again with the pronunciation and apologies. So we're going to tackle all of these questions with us. And again, I'm sad Emily's not here. She sends everybody her best, and she was very much of the mind while she was standing on a hill holding her phone at a tilt, trying to communicate her inability to be here today, to encourage everyone in the audience to please shoot us your questions, because this is the last one of these webinars we're doing. And I'll say at the start too, we have an English language survey that officially closed yesterday, but is still up and running. So I'm prepared to give you one more day to fill in this survey, and we'll put the link in the chat. And we also have the survey current in Portuguese, Spanish, French, Russian, Chinese, Arabic, and I'm probably missing a language, but please participate, journalists and media workers and editors. So let's get going. And I'm going to ask all of you this question, starting with you, Maria, because you are somebody who Agnes Callamard, who's one of the UN Special Rapporteurs, has referred to as the emblematic case when it comes to what we've seen at the intersection of disinformation and hate speech and the targeting of journalists with impunity on and offline. And of course, in case anybody is unaware, Maria was earlier this month sentenced to up to 6 years in jail on a criminal charge of cyber libel, which was connected to an historic report on the theme of corruption. But she is known internationally now in the context of disinformation for her work and her organization Rappler's work countering disinformation. So, Maria, you can talk about anything you like with reference to disinformation, but at the outset, I'm keen to hear what you and Rappler have encountered in terms of the main types and sources of disinformation and connected to the pandemic, and particularly where you're seeing that.
So thanks, Julie. It is so nice to see everyone there. And it's also nice to be at the last one, since we were together on the first.
That's right.
one.
Maria was on the first of these.
And since it is always so bleak every time I say something about where we are today, let me share with you that at the IFCN, the fact-checking award this year, we actually won the most bizarre fact check. And, you know, I kind of, I want to show it to you because it's a hilarious fact check and gives you an idea of all of the things that we have to go through, right? So I don't know if you see this.
Oh, wow.
Clean semen is a cure for COVID-19. That won this year's the Global Fact Check Award 2020. But
just to be clear, is this a debunk?
It's a debunk, yes. A doctor actually claimed this, posted it on Facebook, and it spread. So that's today. This is the fact check that we had. Also a cure for COVID-19, but this is a government official, right? So,
and what is TUOB or TWOB? How do you say that?
TUOB. TUOB is like to use steam inhalation as a cure. And you know, this city, Cebu City, has had the most an uptick, a rise in COVID-19 cases. So you can see that the best disinformation comes from government, but also disinformation, information that people want to share looking for a cure. That's the other part that we've seen. And I think Gil, when we were first started talking, Gil talked about this. The problem with disinformation is that if you're in a country where it is a strategy, it's a political strategy, then all sorts of complications happen. And I'm sure we will talk about that more.
Yeah, I mean, we will come to Gil shortly, but it's not just the Philippines where the sort of top-down misinformation and disinformation is a problem. And I should point out for people who are interested, there's a useful study done by my former colleagues at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in April, I think, published around the same time as those Disinfodemic reports, which showed that while only, I think, about 30% of misinformation that they analysed was top down, coming from politicians and celebrities and other officials, it had around a 70% traction rate. So it was more likely to go viral, to be very sticky, and to be shared on social media, which I think is a really interesting point. And of course, as I say, it's not just the Philippines, and we'll come to Brazil where there are notable parallels, but also in North America and in parts of Europe. Natalia, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, you founded or co-founded Coda Story, and one of the key themes, right, is countering disinformation. In fact, you have a specific newsletter focused on the infodemic. So, you know, you're in a pretty specialized and unique position to be able to give us insights into what you're seeing. But can you share with us what kinds of trends you're seeing around types and sources of disinformation? Oh, you're muted, Natalia. I think you have to unmute yourself. It's the old Zoom mute game.
Yes. Yes, we do have a newsletter called The Infodemic, which I thought was such a clever name. And then I realized that everyone else was calling their newsletters and events The Infodemic. So that was quite upsetting. But, you know, I think part of the lesson that we can learn about disinformation in general does lie in the fact that, you know, there is a whole industry has sprung up around it. You know, when I saw this disinfodemic, now that was a new one for me. I was like, what? We have disinfodemic, we have disinformation, we have infodemic, we have misinformation, we have fake news, and there is just so much. And I think that is actually part of the problem, because for me, you know, and you know, I come from the background. I was actually my first real like striking experience of disinformation, the first time when I thought, gosh, this is the biggest story of our times, was when I was covering the war in Ukraine for the BBC. Yeah. And I was not, I was not a newcomer to this. I was born in a country that invented disinformation, the Soviet Union. So even though I didn't live in it for very long, thank God, it really prepared me for that, fact that there were multiple truths. There was the official truth, the real truth, someone else's truth, the media's truth, the dissident's truth. And it's by having multiple truths is how you get a society that is based on lies. But despite having that background, it was definitely in Ukraine where, covering the war from the very beginning, the striking thing about that war was that it was a fake war. There were two parallel realities. There was something that was happening on Russian state TV, on Russian social media, and it was violent and horrible, and towns were bombed, and you would be sitting in the town that you can see is being bombed according to the Russian TV, and nothing was happening there. And it was very disorienting. And I think collectively as journalists, we missed that story. We missed that moment when that war slid from being a fake war, into and became a real one. And I remember standing, for me, it was the moment when I stood in that incredible field full of sunflowers with 298 bodies scattered to the field, a child strapped still in his airplane seat, the Malaysian Airlines Boeing. And I thought, how the hell did we miss this war? It used to be a fake war, and, it's come to this. And I think what, collectively, basically what happened in Ukraine, we allowed the Russian government at the time to set the agenda. We reacted to it. And it's a pattern that I think we as an industry haven't really broken. We treat disinformation with all these many terms that we come up with as this hypothetical crisis. And, most what we do is we react to it as journalists. And I think that is something that needs to change. And I think that's why, for me, that concrete example was Ukraine. I think for us as an industry, we owe a huge debt to Maria, because Maria, has made, and Rappler, the story of Rappler and Maria Ressa have made this thing real and concrete, stop it being hypothetical. And I think to some extent, the pandemic and coronavirus has also had a little bit of that effect. While we've seen, all sorts of, from fake cures to all sorts of information manipulation, we've also seen the governments and social media platforms take this information differently. When it becomes about your public health, when you can see the EU talking about the threat of China and Russia in the way that they didn't before. You can see the platform taking action against the, COVID-19 disinformation the way they wouldn't against the political disinformation. And that is changing because it's made it more concrete. And I think us as journalists, as an industry, this is what we should be striving for as well. We should be covering it as we cover any other story. It's a story that has the victims and the perpetrators, that has those who lose and those who win from it. And that's how, we should be covering it. And I think COVID-19 makes it a little bit easier.
It's a really fascinating take. And so you were reporting, it was 2014, wasn't it? I remember this period quite vividly. I was working in Paris for WANIFA at the time, researching and editing for them. And I can't remember the name of the fact-checking organization that did incredible work. Was it Stop Fake? During that period, the Ukrainian outfit, and one of their editors came to the office and demonstrated what they were seeing. And I know there's a lot of controversy around the narratives of that conflict and the ways in which even disinformation combat was weaponized to an extent. But that for me was a moment of really waking up to recognizing the ways in which social media platforms were being weaponized, for example, which is something that Maria and others have talked at length about since, of course. So just if I can get you to reflect for a moment, Natalia, on what you're seeing in terms of where this disinformation is mostly coming from, where it's most visible, just from your perspective as someone who's studying this and reporting on it on a daily basis?
I think it's coming from everywhere. It's everywhere, and you know, it's coming. But I think there are things that we should worry about more than others. And I think it's the sort of the algorithms and the patterns and the way things spread and the behavior of the social media platforms and the, you know, the tech companies. And I think it's the top-down disinformation, you know, from Brazil to Russia to, I mean, the Philippines, and now unfortunately the United States. You know, it's when disinformation is the strategy, right? It's when lie is a political strategy, when it becomes really important. And I think in this case, you know, Julie, I completely agree with you that it is, you know, I think there've been amazing fact-checking sites and organizations, but I think what we need to, I think a very important junction is the one where we are going to stop reacting to an agenda set by others and start setting our own agenda. And to do that, you know, we need to be finding the stories and not necessarily just responding to the lies that are already out there. So this is where I have a slight issue. I mean, I think it has its space, the debunk, but I think the more the journalism moves from kind of the he said, she said journalism, because once the lie is out there, it's out there, you know, you're not going to do anything about it. So it's more about setting the agenda.
So to summarize it, a more critical, independent journalism that is prepared to draw conclusions based on the facts, not just to debunk facts, although that has an important role. Jane, that's a perfect, that's a perfect seg to you. I know you're in Canada, right? But for BuzzFeed, but North America, and just below you is one of the people most cited, one of the leaders most cited as an example of this top-down disinformation. You know, people laughed about Donald Trump's statement around injecting disinfectant being a potential cure for COVID-19, but obviously that's a pretty deadly piece of mis or disinformation. So, and you have done, often with Craig Silverman, but also of course independently at BuzzFeed, I think some of the most important investigative work on disinformation, not just on COVID-19 related disinformation. But what are you focused on now in terms of the issues? So we'll talk in a little while about, to take Natalia's point a bit further, about the kinds of reporting approaches and formats of storytelling and so on. But just to try and get a global picture here of what you're seeing and where you're seeing it related to the pandemic. Can you just describe sort of the main sources and types of disinformation and where you're finding them?
Right. Well, like you and like Natalia, I'm from Ukraine, I'm from Kiev, so disinformation in Ukraine was also my first brush with the topic. I have been reporting on disinformation since November 2016. And at the time, it was sort of strange to me that reporters in North America and social media companies in North America acted like this is a new problem, like this has never happened before, like there's no precedent to it. When as a matter of fact, activists and governments, I know that in Ukraine, representatives sat down with Facebook and said, Russian disinformation is a problem here. And of course, there's little or no action that was taken on behalf of the social media companies. In November 2016, and in the lead up to during the Trump election, most of North America really sort of reacted as if this is something that's happening for the first time, as if there are no studies, no precedents, and no solutions. And in many ways, almost 4 years later, they're still reporting on it this way. And I think this is sort of one of the biggest obstacles in disinformation reporting. We understand how the information flows. So we have been reporting on this and investigating it for the past 4 years. We understand the flow from YouTube to Facebook groups, to Facebook proper, to more general audience. We understand that temporary disinformation messages like Instagram stories or like chat groups are huge sources of disinformation that we can't track, where we rely on our readers to send that in. But a lot of the reporting and a lot of the conversation around this doesn't necessarily take into account the research that was previously done and the reporting that was previously done, and sort of makes it seem like we're starting from scratch. We're seeing this a lot with the COVID-19 disinformation. With COVID-19, we did see social media companies take some actions, right? But those actions were very, there were pilot programs. Even though we have been talking about this for the last, in North America, 4 years, outside of North America, maybe a decade, it was really like, oh God, I guess now it's bad enough. I guess now we will try some things out. And for reporters, I think that it's really, really dangerous to fall into that trap. Because once you fall into that trap, you risk sort of doing a little bit of PR for social media companies and for stakeholders who are spreading disinformation, rather than showing the fuller picture of the context around it and how the policies, how we know that there might be effective policy solutions to this, how we know there might be effective algorithmic solutions to this, but this one small action that a social media company has not even piloted globally, but tried out in North America, can feel like it's a big action when it's not. And the final thing I'll say is I think that COVID-19 has really opened people's eyes to how global disinformation is and how much it lacks borders. So we see a lot of bad actors targeting the US with disinformation, and that's true. But the US also exports disinformation to other parts of the world. And that is something that many people in the US might not necessarily realize, might not necessarily understand the role that they're playing in not just passing false information on to their relatives or their immediate circles, but how that disinformation spreads through diasporas, through translations, through comments, and how it transcends borders. And that's something that COVID-19, I think, really illustrated before anybody really fully thought about it.
I think this is becoming a theme already, this idea that perhaps journalists in the West have a disproportionate responsibility because of the facts you just described to really report robustly on this story as well beyond the fact check and the debunk to the systemic crisis at the heart of this problem. Let's come back to that idea, Jane, but if I can just get you to, as much as I know you focus on those very issues, and so you're not necessarily doing the daily debunk, but with the work that you've been doing since the pandemic began, what would you say are the sort of top, the trends with regard to the sort of types and sources of disinformation and where you're encountering it most?
We're, even in the US now, seeing lawmakers use disinformation and use conspiracy theories as a way of building up audiences. And that is something that for the US, at least such an overt use of it is quite new. Not going to get into, all politicians lie. But that is absolutely a trend to be aware of, as is global PR firms offering disinformation as a service. And not necessarily disinformation, but social media manipulation as a service. We've done a lot of reporting about how Saudi Arabia and the UAE do this, but we also know that it's happening all around the globe. It's happening in my home country of Ukraine. It's absolutely happening in the Philippines. It's happening all over the world. And that is another case where there are few barriers to information. So this outsourcing of social media manipulation is going to continue to be a growing trend, as it has been a growing trend. And that is a huge area of investigation.
Mm. And we'll come back to the woman people refer to as the canary in the coal mine on this very crisis, that is you, Maria, shortly to sort of elaborate on your experiences of all of this. But Gil Scofield, so you're with Agência Lupa in Brazil, and it's a fact-checking organization predominantly. You report on, you know, the disinformation debunking that you're doing. Can I ask you, from the perspective of a journalist and editor, former foreign correspondent, who is sitting in a country that even a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times described as in the grip of a free fall when it came to COVID-19, just what you're seeing, and I'm sure at the moment, probably more than the rest of us here, you're having a sense of being utterly overwhelmed by misinformation and disinformation. But if you could reflect on what you're seeing for us, and I know you also have a short presentation, Gil, as well, which we'd love to see.
Okay. Well, that phrase from New York Times is not a understatement. We really live in hell here in Brazil. I prepared a brief presentation about our challenges and our actions. I'm going through it quickly. So if you want to develop any topic later, we can do this during the Q&A moments, right? So I try to gather here our most challenges and what we did to fight it. So I will try to share
your screen.
Okay.
Bear with us, everybody. This is always the challenging point.
Okay, yes.
And it's working. It works
It's
perfectly.
okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
well done.
Okay, great. And how can I move it from, can I move it up?
Yeah, so I think you're going to have to use the just the up and down keys on your keyboard. Can you do that? Yeah.
Okay. See.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a Brazilian case. I'm going to be very, very brief. We have some challenges that I want to share with you because I think these challenges are, I can see all those challenges in other countries also. So we have a 210 million population, and this is just to highlight that the pace of disinformation is much, much faster than the pace of the fact-checking and debunking. And so it's a real challenge in terms of we don't have enough people to fact-check and debunk everything that goes on about the pandemic. Fear of the unknown. This is of course, a sentiment that is used pretty much by people to spread misinformation, disinformation, because fear and anger are the two emotions that people connect to when they decide to share content. Mm-hmm. So, and putting in the perspective that the coronavirus is a new virus, and we, until I don't know, the last month of last year, we didn't know that much about the virus. So it's a unknown territory. And with the extra problem here, when you're talking about disinformation regarding political positions, it's just a kind of quarrel, it's just a kind of debate, and that's it. But when you're talking about disinformation regarding public health, we need to pay attention that disinformation kills in some sense. When you say to people, okay, if you're feeling symptoms, you don't need to go to the doctor, just take some hot water 3 times a day that you're going to be cured. This is almost a crime to me, in my personal view. And another challenge is that science is a tough thing and a very sophisticated thing. And to explain this to population, because we're living in the pandemics, is a challenge also. So we need to make science and medical language something more reachable from ordinary people. And last thing was that we have, as said here before, we have a government today that uses this information as a political strategy. And they created a false battle between public health and economy. So the loss and the problems that we're going to have because people are losing their jobs is much worse than the deaths that are coming from the pandemic, for example. It's one argument. And one argument to say that, the pandemic is not that bad, so let's think about getting our jobs back. So it was a constant speech that we are dealing from the beginning up to now, okay? So what we did 2 newsletters. One newsletter for general audience, another newsletter for public health institution and health professionals. The idea is that the health professional and institutions should, spend their time only fighting the coronavirus. Don't make these people fight misinformation. This is our job. So we are providing them with content so that they can use in their platforms, in their social media channels, and spend time only in hospitals and research and finding treatments and whatever. Okay, these are two newsletters very popular in Brazil today. Okay, we had a podcast called Verifica, and we had a first season that was talking about misinformation and disinformation in general, and we decided to do a second season this year, focused 100% on the coronavirus and the pandemic. And then there we talk about the main misinformations, the main fact checkings, the main debunkings, and also interviewing medical scientists, specialists, epidemiologists that are working with the coronavirus in Brazil. Collaboration. We are part of two big coalitions of fact checking. One is the one coordinated by the IFCN, and it gathers, I don't know, maybe 100 platforms from 80 countries. And also Latam Chequea platform coordinated by Chequeada in Argentina. And it's the one focused on Spanish speaking countries. And we made a translation to Portuguese so that people get all this content available to them and spread the information, the verified information as much as we can. Another thing that is a very good strategy, and it worked a lot in Brazil, is that we partnered with Redes Cordiais. It's an NGO focused on stop hate speech on social media through influencers. And what we did was that we worked with them so that the influencers could talk about misinformation also. So we started giving them content, fact-checked, and ask them to spread to their networks. And in Brazil, we are talking about people that talk to 15 million people, 20 million people. The one that had less followers had 8 million people.
Wow.
So it's a powerful tool to spread the fight against misinformation. And also we have two special products that I love very much. One is called Science Lupa. We hired a scientific research, and also a journalist to gather all the databases of what scientific and medical research are made today about the coronavirus. And what we did was, besides creating a database of this and make it available for public, we rewrote these reports in order to make it more available to ordinary readers. So we are taking these academic jargons, the academic special words, and make it so that people could understand it better, right? And also we are partnering using the databases of the two coalitions. We are making intelligence about misinformation, explaining to our readers how some misinformation works in one country compared to other countries. Why you have this specific misinformation in this country that is our neighbor, for example, Argentina, and we don't have this in Brazil. So this is also a way of spreading another views of misinformation. In the pipeline, we have two projects that I cannot get into details right now, but I think that they are important, and I'm going to explain why. One is data visualization. One thing that we figured out in Brazil is that just piling up deaths over deaths wasn't working. So the population was kind of losing the ability to get horrified by the numbers. And it was being like kind of the new normal is talk about like 40,000 deaths, 45,000 deaths, 50,500 deaths. And you don't see the reaction that we see in people when, for example, a plane crashes and 250 people die. So we need to make data visualization so that people could understand better the impact of this pandemic. And the other one was an emotional response, using humor as an anti-disinformation tool in videos. So we're working with this because we have the feeling that people consume content, news content, as much with an emotional approach as a rational approach. I think more with an emotional approach than a rational approach, really. So we think that we need to work with this emotional response. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Gil. And I think I'll come back to you. Some really great insights there. And you've also thrown to some examples of proactive ways of dealing with the crisis in disinformation rather than just simply debunking. And I'm particularly excited to hear about in the future how you go with those two initiatives using humor and dealing with the kind of emotional response stuff and data. Yeah. And speaking of data, as we say on this side of the world, Maria, can I come back to you? Because I mean, I think Natalia and Jane already pointed out that you probably are the one who alerted the journalism community most urgently to the need to deal with disinformation. And I know for a fact you also alerted Facebook in the aftermath of the Duterte government's election, where you used the tools of journalism and investigation to identify the disinformation networks that had helped propel him to office. So can you talk to us about how you're using those techniques and tools to approach the COVID-19 disinformation, and also, you know, how you're responding to this crisis based on what you've learned from 4 long years of dealing with what you refer to as, you know, the tools of freedom of expression, the social media platforms having been weaponized against free expression.
I think so. I so agree with what everyone has said, but I think that we journalists, this is not to downplay our role. I think our thinking slow processes, our telling of stories, or trying to just is not going to cut it. I think that the platforms, the social media platforms, are designed in a particular way. They are not normal delivery systems. They don't kind of array it out for you and then you get to choose and pick. These are behavioral modification systems, and they are designed, right? Almost, I'm thinking if there's a social media platform that isn't designed this way, they're designed to actually like attracts like, right? So in the algorithms that they've put in, the way they've engineered growth is by to have us choose friends of friends. And just by doing friends of friends, it actually builds radicalization into our society, because if you are rightist or leftist, where you all used to be here, you would be pushed because you're choosing more and more like you start to lose the other side or another. We lose the nuances because you're now only talking amongst yourselves. This moves further away, and then it makes facts debatable. Lies laced with anger and hate spread fastest. It is manipulative. It is meant to divide. It reminds me of terrorists. You know, it is us against them, and that is part of the reason our world isn't where it is today. I think the other part I want to pick up from both Jane and Natalia is that Ukraine really was seminal. I mean, we figured out how to deal with the attacks against us, these information operations, from looking at how Ukraine dealt with it. And we were all, I think, knocking on Facebook's door around the same time. But I think keep in mind this part. When you're doing influencer information operations, at the very beginning of it, first year or so, you can say this is coordinated inauthentic behavior because you could see it getting pounded in.
Which is the term that Facebook uses, isn't it? The CIB.
They call it CIB. Yeah. But if you do that, and if you're 4 years in, right, this becomes authentic, because the goal of influence operations is to change people's minds so their behavior is changed. That's why I say it's a behavioral modification system. And I'll use myself as an example. In 2016, seeded in social media is the idea, Maria's not a journalist, she's a criminal. Journalist equals criminal. Pound it 1,000,000 times. The first time they hear it, they laugh because it isn't true. But by the 1,000,000th time someone has heard it, they begin to doubt. And then 2017, it comes out of President Duterte's mouth. Government officials say it top down. You're sandwiched. By 2018, 11 cases and investigations are filed. 2019, arrests and arrest warrants, 8. 2020, conviction. Where's the reality? This is what I start calling death by 1,000 cuts. So we cannot fight a thinking fast problem with thinking slow solutions, which is the way we journalists think. And I know Natalia spent a lot of time looking at the technology that can deal with. We're trying to build a platform that will try to do this. But frankly, in the short term right now, if we want to protect our democracies, if we want to have integrity of elections, the social media platforms have got to kick in. And they are doing it at a way too slow of a pace. Julie, you wrote a piece today.
Sorry, go on.
I just saw a piece cross, the one that you wrote on what's Facebook's role in my criminalization, in my conviction. I would say quite a lot, because it seeds the ground. It has enabled the rise of these populist leaders who have consolidated power, using these platforms, using disinformation as a political tactic, tearing down journalists, news organizations, because critical to their consolidation of power is getting rid of any kinds of challenges, and journalists pose challenges.
Thanks, Maria. I was going to flag up something you said to me very recently, I think in an interview for that piece, where you said that what you described there as behavior modification systems, when you referred to the way social media works, you said it was like COVID-19 in your head, which really struck me as a potent representation of what we're dealing with. You know, it's viral, it messes with your head, it certainly, you know, creates illness on a pandemic scale in democracy and so on. But can I use that to come back then to the pandemic and how everything that you've just described and what you've learned through this, you know, process of, as you and your colleagues describe it, being forged by fire, you know, in the battle against disinformation, how you're applying that to the COVID-19 crisis in particular. I mean, if people don't trust official sources and you have top-down disinformation discouraging people from appropriate behavior to protect themselves, how on earth can you protect the communities of the Philippines from disinformation in your role?
You really can't. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say is that, you know, we do our best with what we have. But on the behavioral modification system side, right, imagine that all of us have put things into these platforms. They have all of our data. They know us more intimately than we know ourselves. And they actually sell our most vulnerable moments to the right message, whether that's paid for by a government or a corporation. That's the goal of changing our behavior. I say that because I think this is a moment where globally we need to take concrete actions, because I know we can spend a lot of time talking about what we can do as journalists for it. Look, we're a fact-checking partner, right?
Yeah,
but
with Facebook,
I know that doesn't do anything. I mean, the only thing it can do is I find the lie, and then I can figure out the network that spreads the lies, and then we can look at recidivist networks, right? We treat them like terrorists, but that is still a workaround. If the platforms wanted to, they could restore facts. And that, I think, should be our call. We should demand that, because this is manipulating us and allowing governments to manipulate not just what's in your mind, what you're thinking, but it is radicalizing all of us to a point that makes democracy, it's killed democracy.
Which is a really frightening prospect. I know that's your experience in the Philippines indeed, and it's something people are worried about from North America to Brazil as well. Gil, I saw your hand up. I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I just want to highlight some resources that I see colleagues have started sharing resources in the chat, which is great. One of them is from UNESCO in 2017, which is actually, I think, Maria, the first piece that was written about your struggle with these disinformation networks and the impacts your exposure of them were having on you as an individual editor and your colleagues, that sort of, you know, these exponential viral attacks on you. the most horrific abuse, which is continuing and escalating today even. Also, ICFJ published in 2018, back to something that I think Natalia mentioned earlier about the timeline of this. You know, we've known this since the period of the Ukraine war and before. So this timeline was written by me and a colleague from the ABC in Australia, Alice Matthews. And it was a timeline from Roman times through to the present day, the evolution of disinformation and propaganda and misinformation. So that was written for, oh my gosh, we've got a cat from the BuzzFeed correspondent in the chat. That was a moment to preserve. Sorry. So that was really useful as well. And these disinfodemic reports, if anybody, I think my colleague Kalina Boncheva might be there, if you could post those as well. And among our guests, any other resources you want to post in the chat, that would be great, because I think the more we can access these materials and the more we can share them, the better. So I'll come to you in a second, Gilbert. I want to go back to Natalia first. And if you could, respond to what Maria said there in terms of thinking about what this ecosystem failure, if I can describe it as that, means for journalism. And if we consider journalism as a set of responses, a bulwark, if you like, against, you know, the infodemic, the disinfodemic, and I hear you, the labels become problematic, Natalia, but what can journalism best do, therefore, practically to respond? Your mic, Natalia.
Sorry, I never learned. Maria and I actually had a sort of semi-conversation on messages about this weekend, because I watched Maria do an interview with Stephen Sacker from Hard Talk on the BBC, and it was an excellent interview, as always, of course. But as I watched it, you know, I got slightly annoyed about, because the style of Hard Talk and the style of the interview is obviously this very quite aggressive, understandably, like devil's advocate approach, right? So Stephen Sacker was grilling Maria on the details of her legal case. So a lot of the program was spent on talking about these details of this, ridiculous case against her. And I was thinking about how when this program was set up in 1997, it was really designed to hold the powerful to account. And how, more and more often I've noticed over the years how the number of politicians and leaders on that program decreased, and it was the people who are on the receiving end of kind of abuse of power that now turn up. And why is that? It's because the politicians and the ones who are in power have their own platforms where they set their own agenda, and they are empowered by social media platforms. I mean, obviously they also have, depending on the country, access to broadcasters and TV, but social media, the fact that there is a screen with Trump's Twitter feed in every newsroom now, Trump has his own platform. They all have their own platforms. And I think, this is nothing against Stephen Sacker or his excellent interviewing style, but that's also part of the, I don't think we've accepted this dramatic change in the delivery mechanisms that has happened, and we're still playing, we're just playing catch up, so we need to be coming with new ways of addressing these issues. We shouldn't be we should be somehow putting Facebook executives into the Hard Talk chairs and asking them these questions. So I mean, not exactly, and I think part of that is also the fact that I always feel, the digital, I mean, Maria talks about the digital kind of public space much more eloquently than I do, but the loss, we need to internalize and understand how qualitatively different the digital public space is from the physical public space. And the comparison that helps me personally is the shopping mall versus the public square comparison. You know, shopping mall in some ways is more pleasant. There's an AC on a hot day and the heating on the cold, and you can still see your friends and hang out and, you know, have your food and all of that, but it's controlled by someone else. It's not public space. You can't hold a demonstration. And yeah, I don't think we have fully grappled with that as an industry and as a society.
Particularly as an industry, we are bound up. I mean, I've called this in Reuters Institute research publications platform capture, this idea of, you know, being bound up, partly dependent on the platforms with, you know, their investment, but also access to large audiences and so on. So this, I guess, does become perhaps part of the story we need now to tell to broader audiences to help them understand what we're struggling with. Jane, and again, I apologize for the cat joke, but I couldn't resist. Because, and let me just say this, you know, I make the cat joke. My daughter, who is 10, asked me who I was interviewing today, and I said, I described Jane, who's from BuzzFeed. She literally said, oh, BuzzFeed, they did the best interview with Hermione Granger, the actress, Emma Watson, with Emma Watson surrounded by kittens, and it was incredible, and it made her respond in ways, you know, she hadn't seen before. So there's your 10-year-old media critic giving you the praise. But when it comes to disinformation, all of those, you know, there's critiques we hear all the time about BuzzFeed is, you know, it's shallow, blah, blah, blah. You guys have done some of the most robust reporting, investigative reporting on disinformation networks. And you mentioned before what some people term the sort of black propaganda or the PR firms for hire. Can you just talk to us about that? Because I think you're you know, really accessible journalism exposing the ways states and corporations have been using these agencies to spread disinformation is really important work. But, you know, how does it relate to dealing with, say, COVID-19 and the pandemic? And are you starting to see any of that kind of playing a role in terms of the disinformation that's flooding around COVID-19?
So with the COVID-19 and also in addition of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been just like a huge onslaught of information that I think many reporters, myself included, have to first understand before we investigate. And that is a pattern with any disinformation about a single event. First, there's sort of a flood of everything being thrown at a wall. And then you take a step back and then you say, okay, now what was maybe accidental? What was deliberate? What do we investigate here? Early on, something that we found out about the coronavirus is that it immediately hit on those political interests and immediately hit on sort of people spreading false information or people manipulating information in bad faith. We just before the world exploded, we published an investigative report about these PR firms that politicians, and not just politicians, but even regular companies turn to as a way of manipulating social media in their favor. And we found this is happening across the board, across continents, across countries. It's really not, you know, the problem of one region or another region. It's a global issue. And something that that really stuck out to me is how vast the tools that these PR companies have are. So when we think about disinformation, we sort of default to Craig's excellent reporting, my colleague Craig Sillerman's excellent reporting on sort of these Macedonians who created websites that look like news websites, but were really spreading false information that a lot of people believed in 2016. I think that is sort of where a lot of people's minds goes. But that's not the only way disinformation and social media manipulation presents itself. And that's not the only way that these PR firms are thinking about it. Some of the other things that they're doing is creating fake personalities on Twitter. Very often, those are journalists. Very often, they are impersonating journalists, and there's a credibility theft going on there. We also know that these PR firms are spreading false information or just very loaded, hateful information in the comment sections. It's not necessarily linking back to an article. It is moving the conversation away from something reasonable and towards something more extreme, like Maria described. We also know that images and videos play a huge, huge role in this. Images in terms of memes are really tricky. There's no sort of quick way for a social media user to fact check them. And videos as well. They rather than worrying about deepfakes, which are computer generated, fully fake video, we are much more worried about real videos that, not even manipulated, are just taken out of context with a quote that says something completely irrelevant. It's a much quicker, much dirtier way to spread this information. And we see PR firms doing this as well. We see politicians turning to those PR firms because it's effective. The reason why the industry exists is because it is effective. And it is also fairly cheap, as opposed to, you know, your traditional pre-internet explosions advertising campaign. This is something that can be done very quickly and very effectively. And with PR firms, part of the challenge that they create, and I think that's part of the challenge that researchers at social media companies say they're butting up against, is it creates a barrier between the person who asked for the information environment to be manipulated and the person who's doing the manipulation. So when we investigate PR firms or social media manipulation campaigns, we can only go as far as the PR firm. That's where we hit a wall. Because although we can say this is favorable to government X, this is on message with government X, unless somebody at that PR firm is willing to leak us information saying that it was government X who ordered this campaign, we can go no further. We do not have proof.
So it takes defectors or whistleblowers, effectively.
Yes, precisely. And with the coronavirus, we're not quite sure what the involvement of PR firms is yet. We do know that Facebook has found some PR firms that have been sort of using the coronavirus as a way of building audience and spreading out political messages. But we do know early on that in the US, as we reported, the people attempting to misrepresent the virus, whether saying that it's a weapon, blaming China, had political interests. There was a website that Steve Bannon was directly tied to that in January, early on in January, started spreading false information about the coronavirus. So coronavirus creates this huge opportunity, but also a huge amount of information that reporters need to be able to sift through and might not necessarily always be able to get to the bottom of the story because of the wall that the PR firms create.
It's a really important observation. And I mean, does it take a Christopher Wiley who blew the whistle on Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon's connection and the connections back to manipulation of Facebook users in the Philippines and so on, or the people who are now speaking out as they leave platforms about, moral and ethical responsibility. Thanks very much, Jane. And I'm going to come to the question.
I should clarify, because of the question in the chat, that we did not find a PR firm that was directed to Steve Bannon. We just knew that Steve Bannon was associated with a website that was spreading false information, just for clarity.
Thank you for the important real-time clarification. And Gil, I'm going to come to you now, but just to let you know, everybody, there's some great questions in the chat. We're going to devote the last roughly half hour to your questions between all of the panelists here. So Gil,
sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just to take you back, and you can say whatever you want to, contribute now in reference to what the others have said. But I wanted to take you back to something you said earlier at the start, which was around this, the reality of being overwhelmed by information and disinformation and misinformation, particularly in a fact-checking organization in Brazil. But particularly given you're seeing this top-down disinformation from your own president in terms of whether it's about masks, wearing them or not wearing them or whatever it may be. And in fact, I think he was one of the first world leaders to have posts removed because of the potential deadly impacts of the disinformation that he was spreading in the context of the pandemic. But can you, just tell us what you've learned so far and how you try and deal with that. There is significant risk attached to contradicting a very populist president in Brazil.
Yes, it's a big risk. We have been accused. Well, we have been receiving death threats, to this point. But it's difficult because it's the word of the president that has a big. It's still a base of 33% of population supporting him, no matter what he says, no matter what he does, no matter he surrounds himself with the with the most strange and conspiracists and negationist people. Well, he has 33% of approval from population, and that's amazing. I really feel a lot of difficulty in dealing with this because sometimes we are accused of being partisan in fact-checking government, but the thing is, it's the government. So why are you not fact-checking the opposition? Because the opposition is not the government. The opposition barely exists in Brazil today. So every time you're going to check the government, people say, "Oh, you are fact-checking too much the government." Well, first, it's the government, and one of the jobs of journalists is just, be a kind of fiscal of whatever the government is doing, and the government is saying things on a daily basis that are really, really unsupportable in terms of science, in terms of databases, in terms of how the pandemic is moving around the country, and the number of people dead. Always the time to make the pandemic something not that dangerous, the disease not that deadly. So it is pretty complicated because every time we do a fact check like this, we receive a lot of criticism saying that we are being partisan. Oh, you're just talking about the government. Well, the government's the government. I'm not going to talk about an obscure opposition politician that doesn't have any power at all, and not talking about a minister that is saying some things like, okay, the worst of the pandemic is over, when it is not true. We are not going after the worst of the pandemic. And well, so it is difficult. It puts on a situation that we're receiving a lot of harassment every day, death threats. So my crew, my staff is using closed social media. We are doing things like not posting pictures from our sons, from our daughters, from where we live, so that we became a kind of easy target for crazy people in any kind of situation in Brazil. And things are getting crazy here. So if you pick up some supporters of government, and there is a television, a broadcast television, making a live in television, sometimes people get pushed on the face or hidden by a piece of wood. So there is physical violence going on in Brazil against journalists, and it's pretty much complicated. And besides this, we have a situation that is very polarizing in terms of politics, and we are on the verge of elections here in Brazil as well as in the United States. So we see an escalation of the verbal violence that I pretty much fear that it turns into real violence, real physical violence, you know, because we have a speech from an official speech, which is words, that says that these things that's happening in terms of violence is just a normal consequence of the debate.
Wow.
As violence, physical violence, was a normal consequence of a speech, a debate, a political debate on social media or on traditional media, whatever. So kind of normalizing violence in terms of what's going on as a consequence of what's going on towards the election. So I'm
also bound up with the pandemic, yeah? So because of the politicization of responses to the pandemic, and you know, I would argue that facts aren't partisan. You can have a debate about truth, but facts are not partisans, and you've made very clear how hard it is to try and justify the constant attention on misinformation and disinformation in Brazil. But that's the point you make there about the increased risk you're facing in trying to simply cut through disinformation and misinformation to get to facts, to ensure people's safety, leading to you being physically targeted and targeted online, is a really, really important point. And just before we go to questions, I want to bring you back in, Maria, because you really do represent that intersection of disinformation and misogynistic weaponization of social media platforms, and the weaponization of the law in a state that's teetering on the brink of, you know, abandoning democracy, or if they have not already abandoned democracy. Can you just talk to us for a moment about the fact that the facts connected to journalism safety risks for those people around the world trying to do this kind of fact-based reporting in the interest of public health during a pandemic? You're muted, Maria.
Sorry, I do the same thing. So I don't think it's just during a pandemic. I think this is now a fact of our lives as journalists. And let me just say, like, just today, right? It's not just a journalist. This guy who owns, he's married to a Filipina. They run a beauty shop. And all of a sudden, maybe I gave too many details. Anyway, the people who support the journalists who are trying to do this get attacked. Right? And they get attacked with the same types of lies. So someone just called him a pedophile, and he's a businessman. They were told not to go to the beauty parlor, right? So these are things that you're just attacked if you try to tell the truth. I guess I want to also, the other thing we haven't talked about is hate, inciting to hate or inciting hate, and how the platforms, they have different definitions of it, but in general, they nowhere near go, they don't encompass all of the attacks against us, right? Like, I think, I want to show you something that could be a little bit shocking. And part of the reason I've started pulling this out, because, you know, if you've known me, you've heard me talk about all this stuff before, I've normally stuck to one set thing of all of the crap that goes out on social media. But just very recently, I've decided that you should see unfiltered the things that the target sees, because this gives whole new meanings to the word hate, right? And from what everyone has said, the end goal is to deflect attention from what you are trying to do as a journalist. And I'll just quickly share this with you. Share screen. Okay, good. And this is probably, let me collapse this. This is just one slide, and let me pull this up. So this is the network that has attacked journalists, but I want to show you just four memes. This is normal. This is astroturfed in the comments sections. You know, this here, it takes my gender, it takes my facial features, it takes my skin color. And normally the narrative that goes with this is, help me, I will give a reward to whoever hunts down this animal. Okay,
wow.
Thank you. And then the second one is this one of, you know, she's not, this is switching it around again, because it's very clear what's happening. But beyond the turning the narrative around, I have very dry skin. I have eczema. And so you can see when it's in the Philippines and they want to, and the network wants to attack me, they'll blur the photo. And okay, now this next photo, I really debated whether to show this publicly ever, but it's already shown publicly. So I apologize beforehand. They call me scrotum face because I have dry skin. Even my skin has been weaponized against me. And then the last two are these, because they're owned by someone. They take a photo, make it worse. The film 1,000 Cuts is about us. See that Facebook page, Bove PH. They even own it. And then they do a variation of the scrotum face by adding the scrotum. You know, I mean,
yeah,
really,
it beggars belief. Yeah.
Sorry, let me just get out of this. There's all the other stuff that's there. How do I get out there? Hate. So that end goal is to incite hate, right?
Yeah, that's the other part of it, isn't it? It's hate, whether it be you just described and showed. All of us reacted,
apologize,
in a visceral way. No, I actually think it's super important, as you described, for people to be able to see what you see when you're attacked, bearing in mind that you get hundreds of these messages a day. So and disinformation is a feature not just of the attacks on journalists, it's part of the narratives. They'll use false information about you, such as you're opposed to press freedom, try and turn the narrative on you. So the disinformation becomes a tactic in the abuse and harassment, as much as the abuse and harassment is a feature of the disinformation campaign. And just looking at that, I mean, so what do we have there? We had racism, misogyny, if we can say it's a medical condition being used against you. I just, that all of that rolled together is very painful and very damaging. And thanks, Maria, for sharing that. I know it's not easy to do, not easy to see, let alone share. Let's now go to questions, and we'll come back to you at the end. And thanks, this is a really challenging, important conversation. I'm really feeling honored to be part of it. And I hope that the rest of the people with us are as well. So we've addressed this to an extent. Kunal Saikia, again, I'm so sorry, my pronunciation is terrible, from India. There's a flood of misinformation and disinformation here in India. How do we deal with media and institutions spreading this to 1 billion+ people? And what do we do when the government supports these lies or does nothing to stop it? And I think they're getting there too at what we might refer to as media capture, where there are news organizations that are partisan in parts of the world, that are in fact, as much as we're talking about journalism being, sort of having an ability to counter disinformation, we have to acknowledge that in some places all around the world, news organizations are in fact doing the bidding of political actors who may be engaged in disinformation. Who would like to respond to that one? Nobody wants to criticize news organizations. Gil, do you, sorry, somebody spoke. Who was that? Jane?
I just, there's no answer here, right? There's no silver bullet. There's a real limit to how much news organizations can do in the face of an onslaught of false information and in the face of real news organizations doing the bidding of governments. One thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of reporting strategies that we found some success with is showing our audience how we got to the conclusion that we got to when we're fact checking. Mm-hmm. So if it was a reverse image search, we explain that. If it was a video search, we tell them which tool we used. If we saw who owns the website, we explain how. I don't have a study to explain the effectiveness of it, but anecdotally, our readers are much more social media literacy savvy now than they were 4 years ago. They know how to do that image search. They know to check when an account was created. They know the signs to look for. So it's not a perfect solution, and it's not going to work, but that small educational component when you write about disinformation, I do believe is quite important, because a lot of people don't quite know what they personally can do, how they personally can act on this.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So doing that idea of transparency around our practice becomes particularly important when you're dealing with this mysterious global crisis of disinformation, because not everybody, and thankfully most people, don't see the kind of graphic, humiliating disinformation that Maria just described, or they don't see it at the scale that she sees it, for example. I mean, there's a lot that's been written to that question around media capture, about how to deal with the partisan media, and it varies around the world as a problem. And of course, you know, there's a difference between propaganda and media with a point of view. And there's lots of gray territory in there. So we think we need to acknowledge that. But it is extremely hard when you're in a country where you have that top-down disinformation, and some of the most popular media outlets are also peddling disinformation. And Maria's putting her thumbs up, and I know you've experienced that in the Philippines, Maria, as well. So we have another question around data. We have several questions around data, but one from Felipe Herrera, who asks about how we demonstrate data, how we give meaning to the data. And I'll couple that with another question from Jane Dunnage about data visualization. And she makes the point that it works across languages. You know, visualization is really powerful because it has the possibility to speak to people across languages. And she says that with COVID-19, she's not really aware of good examples of the kind of infographics that might be achieving this kind of role as kind of a multilingual piece of data visualization. So does anybody have some good examples of that? And just go back to the Felipe part of this question, which is, I think what he's asking is, when you present data, sometimes it looks like it has a point of view, I suppose because it reaches a conclusion that's different to say the main narrative, which is a fact-checking you know, experience and reality as well. Who wants to take that one? Data visualization examples.
Well, we have some good examples of data visualization regarding COVID-19 on the page of Google News Initiative. They hired a very wonderful professional called Alberto Cairo, and he is also our consultant for this project that we're involved in. And he made some good visualizations of using data gathered by Google search regarding, for example, the evolution of the disease and which topics were most searched according to that moment, you know? So in the beginning, what is coronavirus? What is COVID-19? And then in the second moment, where does it come from? So it kind of helps us understand the evolution of the disease and the misinformation about it in waves, you know? So in the beginning was the origin of it, what is it, and then how it was being passing from one person to another. So the types and kinds of contaminations, and then the mortality rate then was a worry, and then it was evolving to other and then comes the treatments and the drugs and the vaccines, and then the misinformation regarding the statistics, if that number of deaths were real or not. In Brazil, we had a very long misinformation effort in trying to convince people that they were burying coffins empty, so that it gives an impression that the problem is worse than it was already. And it was offending the real the families where we had the real dead people. And it was really a problem here in Brazil. But this visualization is very good because you can see the evolution of misinformation during the evolution of the pandemic. And they talk to each other, the information and the evolution of the pandemic. So it was very, if you have any interest, you go there to the Google News Initiative webpage and follow the data visualization projects. This project is really, really nice. And
thanks for that. That's a very practical tip. And I think people can also go back in these series of webinars, and I think we're going to try and aggregate them all on one in one spot so that people can go back through them. But we had also one of the editors from the New York Times, and I realized, you know, telling somebody in a regional news organization that's deeply underfunded and teetering on the brink of collapse because of the pandemic to have a look at what the New York Times is doing is not the best response. But I think they really have demonstrated very powerfully what you can do with data visualization when you have the capacity to do it and the budget to do it, and blended with your great examples there. Gil, I think that's great. I want to get to another question. We've only got 7 minutes left. And this is one from TN Lansner, who's thanking us for this conversation, but saying, how do fact checkers and journalists deal with mis and disinformation when sometimes it actually comes from the most trusted sources, and they're not necessarily talking about political leaders who we would typically associate with disinformation? They give the example of the World Health Organization and the US CDC and governments in France and UK, where they were actively discouraging face coverings for months because they thought it might lead to perhaps a false security by people, for example. So I guess this gets to the question of, it's not even necessarily misinformation, it's an evolving understanding of approaches to managing the crisis, perhaps. Nevertheless, it's problematic policy, possibly, and needs to be challenged. So they're also pointing to the fact that that's now been a position reversed in all of those countries. And he or she makes the final point at the end that in their view, the media in the UK, for example, strongly supported the government's position on every policy in the beginning, as though it was kind of essential as a patriotic, gesture when dealing with what was being framed as a kind of war. Who would like to respond to that? Yeah, Natalia, you're muted, I think.
Sorry about that. I'll jump in. I mean, not exactly, I agree with you, Julie. I don't think it's necessarily the result of this. It's not necessarily disinformation. And in times of crisis, there will always be unreliable information circulating, right? And sometimes coming from the top. But when the top is dealing with things that they don't know how to deal with. So that's kind of understandable. But one trend that we have noticed is that has become very clear through the pandemic is the preprint papers, because science is in such a rush to come up with solutions that people are putting out these preprints, and preprints are basically papers that have not been peer reviewed. And it's been there've been quite a few studies now. I'll post the link to the story we did in the chat, but there've been quite a few studies now where the preprints have caused a lot of, coming from the scientists, have caused a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation and bad health advice. And in some ways that does remind me of, the misinformation that can come from sort of reputable, respectable news organizations that because of the speed of the information just circulation that we're living in, because we're all, trying to publish so quickly, because there's no newspaper that comes out in the morning anymore. It's all being done in real time. I think we're bound to, when you're standing in front of the camera and have to talk for 5 minutes, it's pretty difficult to make sure that you don't say something that then doesn't turn into. So I think that whole institution of the 24-hour news cycle is a really big part of just disinformation culture and information overload, and the echo chambers that we create where disinformation then thrives. And very quickly, I'll bring one more example of COVID-19 disinformation. We noticed few weeks ago that Bolsonaro came out with a statement saying that WHO, criticizing WHO, but saying, one of the things that he said was like, this is an organization that teaches small children, forces small children to masturbate, teaches small children how to masturbate. And the minute I heard it, I thought, heard that one before. The fact that WHO has made masturbation mandatory for small children in kindergartens was one of the main kind of myths that the Russian state television used in their campaign against the Russian LGBT gay men and women. That was really the campaign against the liberal West. They were saying, Europe, horrible, they, have gay marriage, and WHO forces children to masturbate. And that was pre-Ukraine, right? This is 2013. And to see that lie travel, pop up 5 years later in Brazil during COVID-19. I don't know how you visualize that, but it's pretty amazing.
I definitely don't want to visualize that, but it's pretty horrific, and really illustrative. And because we're out of time, I'm going to make that your last contribution, if that's okay, Natalia. And you can put any other comments in the chat. We could go on for another hour, but we just unfortunately don't have capacity to do that. So I'd like to come to you next, Jane, then Gil, and then Maria for some final words and thoughts. So Jane, over to you. Perhaps if you can respond to the question that a lot of people are asking, which is just how do we deal with this overload? What can we do to meaningfully contribute to ensuring that public interest journalism and factual information is able to be surfaced?
Yeah, these are all difficult questions, and in many ways, what we're living through now, both with COVID-19 and with the revival of the Black rights movement, we're seeing a worst case scenario for disinformation. We're seeing things that I think everybody on this panel has reported on play out in real time and play out very quickly. This is especially true of descriptions of how information moves on social media. There are stories that everybody here has written years ago that are still relevant today. I think in this case, there's also an opportunity because social media platforms have very clearly become more afraid of the direct effects that disinformation can have. We've seen this throughout the years with shootings that happen in the US and sort of a very reactionary take from social media companies. It doesn't quite go anywhere. So this is an opportunity where reporters can keep pressing social media companies for answers. And the last thing I'll mention is that social media companies respond to US reporters, but in many ways and many times do not pay the same level of attention to smaller markets, international reporters. And you can see this in Facebook fact checking as well. You can see how many fact checkers are assigned to English language regions versus non-English language regions. And often the influence is outsized. But because disinformation doesn't have borders, I would say that especially US reporters should look outside the US and focus on how this is playing out in other countries, both as a way of understanding what will eventually happen to the US, as we've described on this panel, but also as a way of supporting reporters whose livelihood is being put in danger because of this problem.
Thanks, Jane. It was very powerfully expressed. Gil, I'd like to ask you next for your response to that prompt.
Okay, I just want to add to James' words. One thing that we couldn't be able to discuss here, but I think it's very, very important, and it's going on right now, which is the decision of the great big multinational corporations to withdraw advertising from Facebook. So what they are telling Facebook is that we are going to come back only, and if only you can establish a methodology that can separate clearly what is freedom of expression in one side and hate speech dash disinformation on the other side. So I think this is very important. This is unique. I never heard an orchestrated movement of powerful companies. And we all know that, you know, the social media platform, they have all their principles and blah, 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 the ethics, this and that. But the fact is that money makes the world go round, right? So money is important. And at this time, what the companies are doing is like they are picking up on the region that affects Facebook the most, the pocket. So this is a very, very important phenomena that we should follow right now with a magnifying lens and pick up all the information. We can do this because we are on the verge of seeing the platforms, you know, it finally make some positions, adopting some positions regarding the awful misinformation and hate speech that spreads all around the platforms. And it's not only, it happens not only in Facebook, it happens in Twitter. But if it's been well succeeded in Facebook, for example, it's going to spread around the whole platforms. Because what they did is that they stopped doing this from in Twitter, in Facebook, and in Instagram. So let's follow this and see what we can, you know, find from and see that if the platforms put themselves in a position of not being kind of, okay, this is not my obligation. It's not me that I'm going to say what is freedom of expression or what is hate speech. No, now they are being forced to assume a position. And this is very interesting for us to follow.
Thanks, Gil. And I think it's also important to note we didn't have an opportunity to talk about, say, the real problems within the closed networks, such as WhatsApp, for example, which of course is also owned by Facebook. But those platforms where we see, especially in places like India, for example,
Brazil also.
Brazil, exactly. Many other countries where this is really, really, really difficult to intervene on as well. Maria, the final word goes to you. And I think it's fitting that, as you said, we're ending this series with your voice. We began it with your voice. So how would you like to respond to all of the things we've heard?
You know, all of the things that we've gone through, and I'll build a little bit on what everyone has said, all of the things that we've gone through in the Philippines is all about holding power to account, stop the impunity. And I think you're right, Jane, American journalists have tremendous power here to actually hold the platforms to account. Many of them are friends of mine, but they can't do much. So, I actually have always said, I can go to jail because of what the platforms haven't done, because that is where the message is seeded. So the first is we have to fix the information ecosystem. And, I've nudged for 4 years, for a long time saying, this is enlightened self-interest. You don't want to live in a world where democracy dies. You don't want to live in a world where we can't tell fact from fiction. And then I think the second point is connected to the question, Jane mentioned other countries around the world. Take a look at India, Myanmar, still ongoing, Sri Lanka, the Philippines. There's lots more places like us. If you fix your problems in the West, if you don't fix your problems, it trickles down to us and it gets much, much worse. The last thing is, you asked what happens if people make mistakes, like people who you would normally trust. I think this is the part we need to remember, that we're standing on the rubble of the old world, and COVID-19 just smashed the rest of it. We understand what disinformation is doing, and we're playing whack-a-mole with every single one. In terms of COVID-19, people don't have the answers. And I think it's okay when they say they don't have the answers. the problem in countries like the Philippines is they pretend to have the answers and then they remake the data, right? So we hold those kinds of acrobatics. We call them out, but I think we can also be gentler, because then that means people can actually say, I don't know. Because I think that's the other problem right now. It's so polarized and so full of hate. And it's a time where we really don't know, and we don't know how to handle it. So please, thank you for letting me be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you so much for finding time close to midnight, or even after midnight. I think we are now potentially in the Philippines, where, to remind everybody, as if we could forget, Maria faces up to 100 years in jail for doing journalism. The fact that she continues to speak so bravely and candidly, I think, is incredible inspiration for us all. And I'm sure that Jane, Lytvynenko, and Natalia, Antelava, and Gilberto Scofield Jr., thank you so much for joining us. Emily has been, I'm sure, having the feeling of ears burning because we've missed her, but she'll catch up online afterwards. And thank you everybody who's participated, sent questions, contributed to our survey, which is designed to try and figure out around the world how the pandemic is impacting on journalism, but also how journalism might recover. And we need your input to help us to inform that recovery. So that's it in this series on the Journalism and the Pandemic project from ICFJ and the Tower Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. We'll be back with other webinars and reportage and research write-ups based on our project as the summer rolls on. So take care, everybody. Be safe in all of the ways that we've described here. And thanks so much again for participating. Bye for now.